Hi everyone, Scott Murray here. Thank you for tuning into today's podcast video. As you know, in the last video, what we did is we found ways to get all of your resources together so that you can produce your podcast on a limited budget. Well, today we're going to take the next step and we're going to figure out what we need to do to build the show that we want to build. Before we get into recording, before we get into editing or anything else, there's still a few things we need to do correctly and effectively in order for us to have our best chance for success as a podcast show and have every opportunity to grow our audience. And that's always what I'm going to be focused on in any advice I give anybody in these videos, is making sure that we are making what I would call an audience-driven program. Because, you know, as creative people, as producers, as hosts of programs, we tend to get sometimes too caught up on what we personally think is just awesome. And we have to remember it's more important that our listeners think what we're doing is awesome. And the thing is listeners have very specific taste in what they want to hear and what they like. And you also can't fool them. You know, you have to be completely genuine in what you produce and what you say on your show, because they know it. For example, as we get started today, we need to figure out what our show's about. What is the focus of the program? And the more focused the topic, the better. But, you know, you can have a show that tends to be a little more general, cover a lot more topics, but definitely focus where it's completely clear what you cover is helpful. No doubt about that. And more importantly, whatever it is, you have to be completely passionate about it, because again, your audience will know, because your passion for what you're talking about will come through in your program. And if you're passionate about it, you love it. I mean, let me tell you, podcast listeners will tell you that they can hear it and they like it when you're passionate about what you're talking about. So pick something. You know, it could be a hobby. It could be kind of an approach to life. It could be advice. It could be any number of things. It could be a TV show. There are a lot of successful programs out there dedicated to television series. The thing that I think sometimes gets lost in that process is you also need to make sure that whatever your topic is, you need to make sure you're going to be able to talk about this consistently, week after week, year after year. And if you stop and think, well, I may only be able to talk about this for 7 months. Well, then it probably isn't a good podcast topic. And you'll see this, by the way. You'll see the type of topics that tend to run out because you'll hit iTunes and you'll think, wow, I want to hear this show on this topic. And then they did 12 shows and they were done. Now, granted, sometimes that's because they just couldn't do it anymore, but sometimes it's also because there was nothing else to talk about. So be sure to pick a topic that you can talk about consistently. And I do think you absolutely need to have a weekly show in which you post an episode on the same day each and every week. I think that is probably one of the most important things I can share with you in this video. Become part of somebody's routine, especially the diehard podcast listeners out there that already have other podcasts in their weekly routine. Make your show part of that routine by picking a day and constantly putting that content out on that day. If there was ever something that will affect your chances for success to grow your audience right out of the gate, it's your ability to get that content out on a regular basis. So we now have what we're going to talk about, right? We know we're going to put it out each week. Now what we need to figure out is a logo, which is also really important. I heard Cliff Ravenscraft, a leading voice, if not the leading voice in podcast advice, one time say at a conference that if you have a budget of like $400 for your podcast, spend $300 of that on your logo. That tells you how important a logo is, because you've got to be able to develop it in a way that is going to obviously stand out and then be easy to read after the image gets shrunk down for iTunes. So there's two components to this. when it comes to your logo. First, you're going to need a really good name for your podcast. And when you do that, I think creativity is good as long as it's not so creative that if someone hears it or sees it, they have no idea what it's about. And that's why, obviously, not only are you going to need a good title, but when you send your description to iTunes, it's going to have to be pretty clear what you talk about. But as you develop that title, do something like Google it, make sure nobody else is using that title for another podcast or a blog or something that's going to make it harder for people to find your show. So spend some time coming up with a good title and then figure out how to work it into a logo. And remember, for iTunes, that logo needs to be 1400 by 1400. And then more importantly, it has to be produced in a way that when it shrinks down to iTunes size, that you can still read everything, or it stands out in a way that people are going to look at it. Now, granted, I know that not everybody out there is a graphic designer. I'm not a graphic designer, but there are still things you can do to get an effective logo produced. And here's 2 things that you can do. One, you can do it yourself and use an online photo and graphic creating program like Canva or PicMonkey, and then just open up an image 1400 by 1400 and then start building a logo with text and everything else. Now, if you need some images to go with it, there are tons of places out there where you can get royalty-free photos, websites like Pixabay, and just build a good logo and then shrink it down when you're done and make sure that even if it's, this big, that you can still read everything on it and it still stands out in a way that is going to work for your listeners. Now, if you don't want to do that and you really want just to get somebody else to do it, but you're like, I don't have the money to spend on a graphic designer, well, don't worry. You can still hire one and not break your bank. And here's one of the ways you can do it. Go to a website called Elance, and there are other sites like that, but I use Elance, and post in there that you need someone to create a graphic for your podcast, a logo for your podcast. And then in that description, Elance will also allow you to say, I can only spend $60, and then find out what happens, because essentially what happens on Elance is there's going to be people who bid on being able to do that job for you. So you're going to have somebody go, I'll do it for you for $25. I'll do it for $50. And you'll probably have someone who will say, hey, look, I have 100 years of experience doing this. My rate's a little higher, but I'll do it for you for $75. Give them direction as to what the show's about, what you're looking for, and then you can hire somebody to make it for you without having to spend too much money. Then I think the last part of our video today will focus on the first early stages of your format, deciding what that format's going to be, which is also really important, because in the next video we're going to talk about building that in the program with production elements. But you're going to have to decide, is this something where I think the discussion or what I'm going to talk about is going to last 20 minutes, 60 minutes? I think if it's going to be in the 60 minutes realm, you'll definitely want to watch the next video about production, because I think it'll be really important to kind of break up the monotony a little bit. The other thing that I think is really important in this is, when you decide to host the show, it is incredibly important to just be yourself. Be yourself. Don't try to be, radio personality guy or girl. Don't try to be over wacky. Don't try to be somebody that you're not. Don't try to be your favorite personality on TV. Put your brand on it. Put your personality on it, and people will appreciate it. And I think if you're going to go longer than 15, 20, 30 minutes, even in a 15 or 20 minute show, I think this is important. Get a co-host. Find somebody to have a discussion with. I think listeners will appreciate it, and it's another thing that you can give your listeners to like about your show, because of the chemistry between you and the other person, or other 2 people, if you decide to add 2 people, is really good. People will love that. They will start to get kind of used to your host and really kind of feel like everybody's friends, that they're hanging out with as they listen to their show. And I think that's a really important thing. Now, you may be sitting there saying, I don't know who I'm going to get to co-host my podcast. Well, here's something you can do. I've done this. Hit Twitter. If you don't have a Twitter account, go ahead and create one. You're going to need one to market your podcast anyway. And just do some searching. Search podcasts, search podcaster. If your show is on, let's just say, your show is on the TV series Gotham, or you're doing a podcast on model making, okay? Search model making, search Gotham, and you're going to find people all over Twitter that are passionate about it. And then you can reach out to them, connect with them, especially if they have a website or an email listed where they can be contacted, and say, hey, I'm developing this podcast and I'm looking for a co-host. I was wondering if you and I could have a Skype conversation, okay? And this is where this gets really important. If the person comes back and says, yeah, I might want to do that. Well, obviously, you need to make sure they have a good voice for your podcast, and that they talk to you and work off of you really well. So there's two things you can do. Schedule a call to have with them on Skype, or you can do it by phone, but I think Skype would be better, because you might even record it and just say, hey, you know what? Let's talk about model making for a few minutes, and I'm going to record it, and just let's get a feel for how we sound. And then you can record that conversation and then just say, thanks for your time. I will let you know what I decide for the show. And then listen to it. And if you think the two of you sound great, you have a co-host. It may even be a good idea to have friends hear that sound file, and go, how do you think this sounds? And they can tell you, I think you guys sound really, really good. And do that with 3 or 4 other people, and then narrow it down, and you've got a co-host. Another place you could get a co-host is there are several podcast groups in Facebook and LinkedIn. Become part of those groups, and then just post one day, hey, I'm launching a new podcast on model building, or I'm launching a new podcast on Gotham, and I need someone who loves it as much as I do to be a co-host on the program, and you might be surprised at the number of people that respond. And I think that's something that people have to remember, because I wonder sometimes when I hear a person do a 45-minute podcast and it's just them, I wonder, why didn't this person get a co-host? And maybe it's because they just didn't know where to go get one. They didn't have a friend. You don't always have to do it that way. There are places online where you can meet people and make them part of their show, and it works. Because look, at the end of the day, you just got to have the gift of engaging gab to be able to go on a show, hold it on your own, and talk nonstop for 30, 40, 50 plus minutes. 9 times out of 10, I would say, give or take, it's not going to work. You really have to have just a lot going for you to hold an audience attention by yourself for that long in a podcast format. So get co-host. Or if you want to test it out and see what the audience thinks, you might even be able to do something where it is kind of you for a while, and then you just have a kind of 2 or 3 people that you incorporate into the conversation. But I think at some point in time, it's really good to get somebody established that your audience can get to know and like, because they hear them each and every week. Okay? So that's what I would do next as far as developing the next steps for creating an audience-driven podcast. Again, that's what's key. So in our next video, what we're going to focus on is producing that first show and how we can make a really good audience-driven program based around what we're going to talk about and offer to the audience in a way that they're going to want to hear and not miss each and every week, and make it part of the routine. So again, if you have any questions about anything that was discussed today, feel free to leave those questions in the comment section. And if I don't know the answer, I will try to find a way to direct you to someone who does. I'm not the kind of person that, I think I'm such an expert, I'm just going to have an answer for everything. Because, even as a podcaster who's been doing this for a while, there's still things we learn on a regular basis that we didn't know last week or last year. And but one of the great things about the podcasting community is we're all kind of there for one another. So that's what I'm trying to be for you. So if I don't know the answer, I will try to still find a way to help. But if I do, I will definitely incorporate that into another video or just answer it right out. So I'm hoping this is helpful to you as you get your podcast started. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.